Welcome back to the Builders Bench. I'm Craig Larkins. It was a big day in Ottawa this week as the 2025 federal budget was released for Canadians to see. Now back on the bench from Toronto, Louis-Philippe Champagne, Associate Vice President of Public Affairs with the Canadian Construction Association. And from Vancouver, Sajjid Lakhani, Director at Impact Public Affairs. Now Ottawa is calling this a nation-building budget, $141 billion in new spending with build communities on promise. LP, we have been talking about this budget since I think we started this podcast in early 2025. So in a minute or less, give it to me, lay it on me. What is your initial reaction to Prime Minister Carney's first budget?
You're right. We've been talking about this for quite some time. It's the last federal budget in Ottawa was in the spring 2024. It's a while ago now. It's a year and a half ago. It was under a different Minister of Finance, a different Prime Minister, before the election, of course, and before Donald Trump came to office. So times have changed quite a bit, and the fiscal policy of the government has changed accordingly. There's a lot to say about this budget. The government calls it generational investment. The opposition calls it generational debt. I'm not sure if it's generational at all, but one thing is sure is we do have a budget, and it's a big one for construction. Let's start with a big number, $80 billion in capital expenditure over 5 years. That's a whole lot of taxpayer dollar that's going to be moving from the federal government to communities and industries and construction projects across the country. Out of that 280, $115 billion are going to infrastructure investment specifically. This is something that the industry has been asking for years. We believe there's a drastic need to reinvest in infrastructure to make sure that the aging infrastructure is modernized and that we can scale up to what Canada needs. There's a drastic deficit that has been going on for probably decades now. This is a step in the right direction in resolving that issue with federal funding and federal leadership. Interesting point in terms of infrastructure investment is that almost half of that $115 billion is going to local housing enabling infrastructure. Again, something we believe at CCA is the core bottleneck of residential construction in Canada. So all in all, very good things, very good numbers, but all is not perfect, of course. People from the Conservative Party and many opposition across Canada will say, well, that's a lot of spending. That's a lot of deficit. It's something that Canadians need to be mindful of, and I'm sure the government is also mindful of. It is going to be a few years of slowly diminishing deficit, but it's a lot of money that's going out of the government's bucket toward these priorities. There's also more in terms of workforce and supply chain and whatnot, but I'm sure we'll talk about all of this in today's episode.
Yes. I have an exciting list right in front of me. Sajjid, lots of drama as well. In Ottawa yesterday, we had an MP cross the floor. What are your thoughts on the initial budget and activities going on in Ottawa as of lately?
Yeah, absolutely. And rumors are that more MPs may cross today. And perhaps that signals the fact that this budget is generational. Perhaps it signals just a distrust or lack of enthusiasm within the caucus in terms of leadership. However, in terms of the budget itself, great budget for the construction industry, perhaps less so for social service partners or stakeholders in that department. However, I found it very interesting the many different avenues that the construction industry can be involved through this budget. Defense spending especially, and defense procurement, as well as not just nation building here in Canada, but you can see throughout the budget, the Prime Minister is very adamant that Canadian construction companies in the industry will be able to be a part of the rebuilding of Ukraine, which is quite remarkable in terms of the next steps that the industry can take, not just here in Canada, but be a part of the overarching Canadian defense mandate and plan. With that being said, of course, the foreign credential recognition program that in the budget specified that it was mainly for construction and health sectors. It'll be interesting to note how that is managed alongside the Prime Minister in this budget committing to lower immigration targets, both in permanent residents and international students. So, governments across the country are stuck in between a rock and a hard place in terms of managing government budgets, debts, deficits, and relations with our southern border. However, perhaps this was a budget we would have liked to see 10 years ago when President Trump first got into office, and perhaps we could have had an early pivot there. However, it may be tough for this government on a communication angle to sell this budget because there's very few retail politics tangibilities behind it. Great for us in industry, but perhaps harder for, an average family to see the benefits when the Trudeau government really made it institutionalized for certain tax credits and all that for certain demographics.
Yeah, the real challenge would be convincing Canadians of their decisions and what this all means for them at home, right? And I think some buzzwords that we've been talking about, pulling out of the budget, infrastructure being one of them. A big centerpiece of the budget was the Build Communities Strong Fund, $51 billion for local infrastructure. And as LP had mentioned, that's part of the $115 billion total package for roads, ports, hospitals, transit. LP, the details are thin now. I mean, we still have to get this budget voted on. We should mention that as well. This hasn't passed yet, but how fast will this translate to shovels in the ground if it's passed?
Yeah, it will take some time. You're right. First of all, the budget cycle in Ottawa will take a few months to get to BIA, Budget Implementation Act. Sometimes plurals, to act is quite common. So we're talking here about late fall, potentially in the spring. And then this need to actually get distributed through agencies, through departments, through procurement process that can take some time. And that speaks to your earlier point about how Canadian might not feel the immediacy of the benefits that they see there, as opposed to a tax credit that applies to you to write the next fiscal year or something of that nature. Federal government policy tend to be very remote from the people. Right? There are decisions taking place in Ottawa that have ramification on years to come. When you start to invest in defense, it transforms the role of Canada in the world in terms of security, not this year, not next year, but really in decades to come. Same thing for many of these investments. Those are important policy direction that we hear now that we'll see having impact on a long-term schedule. It's not as immediate as municipal politics, for example, where you'll have a decision at City Hall that take place and then the road is being repaired the next morning.
That's very good point as well. And one thing Janine Martin and I, president of VRCA, were chatting about yesterday is, all the governments need to align and get on that same page when we're doling out the funds so that we can see some movement on it. One of those key components, Sajjid, was the housing Build Canada Homes. We've talked about this briefly on the podcast before, $13 billion over 5 years. Let's just touch on that again. It doesn't really impact BC when we're talking building homes as far as the numbers. We were left off that list.
Yeah, it's interesting to note that originally we had discussions about how much BC could be a part of the Build Canada Homes Agency. Right now 1% of BC is federal lands, quite a small amount to develop on. However, based on conversations I recently had at the minister's office, they're using the Canada private trust lands to purchase developments for federal lands and jurisdictions. So perhaps that'll open up opportunity in BC, and that means investing in shovel-ready projects through partnerships with municipalities and development companies. So a positive sign there in terms of how that agency can support BC, but at the core root of the issue, it's moving on this development cost charges that the federal government can often impose upon municipalities and builders. I'm hearing this from not just our industry, but from generational fairness think tanks that advocate for youth fairness and generational fairness, that a lot of core issues around housing revolves around these extra charges that the federal government are imposing upon municipalities.
It's great to see, though, that construction is the engine of this budget for 2025. One key piece, though, and we've talked about this as well, LP, briefly, and CCA did mention this in your media release. The challenge isn't just funding, it's people. We've had members actually reach out after our last podcast regarding the apprenticeships and credential recognition announcements. In your release, CCA says policy is too focused on unionized programs, as we agree, 30% of the workforce. That leaves 70% of non-union left out. Can you break that down for us?
Yeah, for sure. There's been some announcement and policy section related to workforce in the budget. It's not like they've ignored the issue altogether. They certainly acknowledge it, and we appreciate this. There's been good investment done or targeted towards LMDAs and toward foreign credential, for example, two issues that we brought up to the federal government before. Our big concern, as you pointed out, is the significant investment for training and retraining, the UTIP program now they call it, the Union Training Incentive Program. As the name implies, this is very specific to unionized workplace and union workers, which is an important part of the industry and something that we can certainly have the federal government fund. The problem remains the same. When the federal government, or any government for that matter, start tying up unionization or social policy in general to specific funding stream or tax credit like we've seen in the past, this is a problem. This is discriminatory towards part of the industry as opposed to supporting the entirety of it. As you pointed out, construction in Canada is about 30% union worker, 70% open shop worker. So when there is specific announcement like this saying we're going to put, tens of millions of dollars toward training for unionized worker and then leave the other million of Canadian workers to dry, it's a problem. So we need to do better in that front and make sure we have across the board training support for construction, that we ensure we have workers across the entire spectrum of construction in all province, and make sure we don't discriminate against a segment of it.
And CCA is actually calling for a national workforce strategy. What would that look like? What does that entail?
I think the important part in the strategy is getting everybody at the table. The core problem with the workforce challenge is it's not solely a federal matter. It's not only a provincial matter. It's not even just an employment matter. It's also immigration. It's also training. It's post-education, right? So you need to bring all the actors together. And we believe there's a significant leadership role that need to come from Ottawa, that need to come from the Prime Minister office directly to say, listen, we're not going to build any of our homes or bridges or highways if we don't have the workforce needed to do that. How do we solve this? Let's identify the problem. Let's ensure you engage with industry, with academics, with provinces and municipalities so we can find the right solution. This is needed yesterday, really. Now that we have significant project for Canada, the desire to invest in our future, that's great. Let's make sure we have the tool and most importantly, the men and women to build these homes and these projects.
You need the boots on the ground to build, and immigration was a key component, as you just mentioned, LP, of that piece of that puzzle. And Sajjid, big cuts to temporary residents, government cutting it by 50%, which will have a big impact on the industry's workforce. Do you want to break that down for us? What does that mean for construction?
Yeah, absolutely. It'll have to be predicated on constant communication with the government as well as the immigration ministry to get more clarity on this as it continues and develops. Because while there is a foreign credential recognition program that's specifically targeted for the construction sector, it'll be hard to manage that while immigration levels are going down, whether that's permanent residents, temporary foreign workers, or international students. However, it seems based on the election cycle as well as the Prime Minister's campaign that this government is not very likely to, increase immigration levels through those channels as much as the Trudeau government did. It's just not in the, it's just not in the support right now. It's not support right now by the public. So it will require industry to ensure that there are clear lines of communication on what this will look like in the budget and how this will manifest in terms of workforce and labor shortages.
So we have the numbers, we have the money. LP, the success hinges obviously on local delivery, permits, workforce, and supply chain. We haven't touched on supply chain yet.
Yeah, big elephant in the room. How do we make sure that our project remains on budget, that our supply chain is stabilized, that we can trust the quotes that we provide? This has been a challenge for years. The building price of construction has been going up for 5 years straight, mostly because of COVID and then the trade war to the US. There's some good news in that regard. Good policy from the federal government to make sure our industry is continuing to be robust. The one thing I'd like to emphasize is in this infrastructure investment we mentioned earlier, there are very specific investment for trade enabling infrastructure, something we've requested at CCA with our federal partner from the Chamber of Commerce and the Civil Construction Council, etc., to invest in this trade so that we can turn to other countries in the US to export our goods, but also to import materials for construction in other industries. So we are very appreciative that the government now is stepping up and saying, yeah, we do need to invest in trade enabling infrastructure. It's a modest amount to get started, but this can go a long way with properly targeted projects. So we are hopeful that through the investment and the the direction the government is taking to ensure our supply chain is robust, things will look better. The one caveat to this is the Buy Canadian policy that was partially announced before the budget, mentioned in the budget, and we are expecting to see a final document being released to the public very soon. This is one more protectionist measure in an ongoing trade dispute, right? So we have been saying as Canadian that Donald Trump's decision was bad for American, that the tariff would hurt American families first. It's just as true when we put counter tariff or put in place protectionist policy. There is a consequence to having these kind of anti-open trade policies. It is a policy that will support the manufacturing sector of Canada, especially in the steel industry. It protects jobs in that sector. But the question is, at what cost? How much of that will have an impact, especially in the price of steel and price of material in general, and who pays the bill? At the end of the day, that comes through construction, but it ends up in taxpayer pocket.
One final question, final remark from both of you. Besides getting the budget passed, what's the one thing Ottawa needs to get right in the next 6 months, if it does get passed, to make this budget real for builders?
For me, it's consultation. It's something that all industries have been lacking for the last many years. The previous Liberal government was not the best when it comes to consult with industry. It was well known in Ottawa. So far, the Carney government has been better at it. I must give them credit. The question is, will this continue now that the budget is out of the way? Will they go to industry, to CCA, to the steel sector and whatnot and say, okay, let's see how we can work together to make this a reality. What are your challenges? How we tackle this? We're hopeful, but there's a whole lot of work that remains to be done, as you mentioned, on workforce and supply chain most specifically.
Sajjid?
Yeah, I'd agree with consultation, taking one step further in terms of partnership. This government needs to ensure that the partnership is strong, not just with the private sector, but Indigenous governments across the country. Considering there were major infrastructure mandates and propositions here in this budget with working with Indigenous governments. So this government needs to ensure that they're in constant partnership with the private sector to ensure that these projects get built, whether that's through the immigration aspect, workforce development, infrastructure, capital projects. It's going to require a whole of government approach. And hopefully this government can coordinate with each other better than the last one, because it's going to require that level to be able to get these projects going.
Exciting a couple of weeks ahead of us. So what is the timeline? Let's break this down. The budget has been tabled. Where do we go now? When do they vote on it? Depending, I guess, if more MPs cross the floor. Lots of uncertainty here, or what's the timeline typically, LP?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, House leaders and parties will have to discuss and plan their strategy. As we are a minority government, we need to make sure that we have relationship with the opposition. Opposition will try to flex their muscle to showcase that they are standing up to the Carney government. The political drama will take place over the next few weeks, maybe months. I think it's possible to see a BIA in this current sitting before Christmas. It's a bit of a tight schedule. It's something we don't really have a lot of views to, right? Because fall budget are not common. It is now apparently the new standard that will be set. So we need to get used to this. But to give you a parallel with the spring, normally a budget is released in March, April, and we see the BIA 1 right before the end of the session in June, and then usually a subsequent BIA 2 in the early fall. So maybe before Christmas, most likely after Christmas. The real reality is that this will unfold over the next many months and years, right? This funding is not for 26. It is for the most part for 5 years, and in some case 10 years. It's a forward-looking vision of the government.
All right. Well, we'll continue to follow conversation right here on the Builders Bench. You both will be back. Thank you, LP and Sajjid, for joining us today. Past episodes of the Builders Bench can be found on VRCA's website and VRCA's YouTube channel. I'm Craig Larkins, and this is the Builders Bench.
Cheers.